Please be advised, Once Upon a Crime is a series depicting true crime incidents in South Africa. The content may not be suitable for sensitive listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The views and opinions expressed during Once Upon a Crime is not that of the SABC and Lotus FM. The victim in today's episode sadly fell victim to a lifelong predator who had managed to ingratiate himself into her family. And by the time everyone around him realized who he really was, it was too late.
Anisha van Niekerk was in her early teens when her mother Jane first met and married Gerard Williamson. The man had a very dark past, including multiple charges of rape against minors and domestic violence being reported in many of his past relationships. But Jane knew nothing of this because Gerard seemed to have dodged every charge against him over the years, possibly by intimidating witnesses and forcing complainants to drop cases. Jane would have her own experiences of abusive behavior with Gerard though, and their relationship was on and off for many years until 2007, when they had reunited and he'd moved in with her into her home in Kempton Park. By this time, Anisha had moved out of her mother's home and was living in Cape Town, but she would regularly come home to visit.
In late November 2007, Anisha flew into Johannesburg to visit her family. Her sister was getting married in December, and this young woman planned to spend a few weeks helping her sister with the final preparations, then attending the wedding, and finally spending the rest of the time with her mother. On Sunday, the 25th of November, Gerard offered to take Jane and Anisha to lunch. He wanted to take his motorbike, but Jane didn't enjoy riding on the bike, so Anisha volunteered to go with him, and Jane could drive herself there in the car. The three set out, had their lunch, and then left the restaurant. With the motorbike being faster than a car, Jane expected Gerard and Anisha to be home before her. But when she arrived at the house, they weren't there. And quite some time later, she was surprised to see Gerard arrive home on the bike alone.
Gerard would claim that he had dropped his stepdaughter off at her request in a street in Glenmarais in Kempton Park. This had baffled Jane because her daughter's cell phone and her bank cards were still at the house. Gerard told her that she was being silly in worrying because Anisha was an adult and she could do what she wanted. This didn't really put Jane at ease because her maternal instinct was already kicking in. But she would manage to hold herself off until the next morning, at which point, when she still couldn't find her daughter by phoning around, she went to the police station to report Anisha missing. Days went by and Anisha did not return home. Her sister's wedding on the 1st of December came and went without Anisha. And this was when everyone truly knew that something was deeply wrong because she would never have missed this event.
2 days later, a man walking on the side of the Babsfontein Bronkhorstspruit Road made a grisly discovery. The body of a female was found lying meters from the road's edge. When police arrived at the scene, they found a severely decomposed woman lying on her stomach. Her arms were outstretched above her head and she was nude except for a shirt which had been pulled up over her breasts. When forensics teams arrived, the first thing they noticed was that there was no sign of blood at the scene, despite the woman having a significant head injury. The murder didn't appear to have taken place at that location, and there was no identification on or near the body. This is a marked problem when an unidentified body comes into the mortuary for an autopsy. We still continue to do the autopsy as we simply cannot wait until a person has been identified because we might be losing any type of evidence that might be present on the body. So we continue doing the autopsy, and in the meantime, a process is ongoing trying to identify the person. First choice for any type of identification would be visual identification. We do, however, take fingerprints of any deceased person as well, which is sent to Home Affairs to make sure that this is definitely the person that was visually identified. However, if a body is this decomposed, a visual identification is simply not possible. So what we do in such a case is to actually take fingerprints and send those off, like I mentioned before. But the next step would be to take DNA from the body. If there is still blood available, blood would be the first choice, but blood starts to degenerate relatively rapidly. We would then rather try and use DNA that can be obtained from dental pulp, so in a tooth, or from bone, either the thigh bone or the breastbone. We might also try and use other identifying features, such as prostheses that might be present in the body, or if a pacemaker has been fitted. Those carry serial numbers which can be used to identify a body, but this is obviously not relevant in Alicia's case. Lastly, one could make use of forensic anthropology, where anthropologists look at a body, study the body, and gives an estimation. Firstly, they might assist and tell us in telling us this is male or female deceased, the possible race of the deceased, and then an age of the deceased, but with a relatively wide reference range. What is possible is forensic odontology, but that is a problem in South Africa, seeing that there's very limited people that have access to ante-mortem, so before death dental work. So there's nothing to compare a post-mortem X-ray of the teeth to. The same applies for facial X-rays, seeing that people in South Africa don't always have access to medical care. It's not necessarily easy to take an X-ray of the deceased person and compare that with a photograph or X-rays that was taken before death. But in this case, the body would be initially identified using fingerprints, which would be taken from the body in a fascinating way. This is a method that was first used by Professor Dion Knobel, who was the head of department at UCT. And in that case, a deceased person, a gentleman, was dumped into a lake. And when the postmortem was done, his skin actually slipped from his hands in a glove kind of fashion. And what happened then was that the forensic pathologist could actually slip his gloved hands into those fingers, into that skin, and use that to obtain fingerprints from the deceased person. And this is exactly what happened in Anisha's case as well. And so, once the basics about the identity of the victim had been determined, race, estimated age and gender, the investigator was able to pull all corresponding missing persons reports and narrow down who the victim may be. The prints taken during the autopsy would be compared to those held at Home Affairs for Anisha van Niekerk, and there was a match.
After Anisha's family had been informed of the terrible news of her murder, investigators started looking into anyone who may have had the opportunity and the motive to kill this young woman. As the last person to see Anisha alive, Gerard Williamson was a major person of interest, and when police started speaking with others about the man and his history of abuse and sexual predation came up, the dots began to connect. And from the way Anisha's body had been found, it seemed clear that there was a sexual element to her murder. The helmet and the jacket that Anisha had been wearing on the day she went missing was taken as evidence, and police also found a pair of sunglasses at the scene, which would be a vital key to solving this case.
During their investigation of Williamson's phone and social media, police actually found a photograph of him on his motorbike, and in the picture, he was wearing a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses, which perfectly matched the pair found on the scene. Although this was significant evidence on its own, Williamson could have argued that he borrowed the sunglasses to Anisha, so they needed more than that. And the analysis of the helmet and the jacket would provide that evidence. Anisha's blood was found on and inside the helmet that she'd been wearing when she disappeared. This was conclusive evidence because Williamson had been in possession of the helmet. Police believe that the extensive damage to Anisha's skull may have been caused by her being struck with the helmet as well as a large rock. Williamson was arrested, and although he initially claimed he was innocent, He eventually confessed to having murdered Anisha, although he continued to refuse to admit that he'd done so because he had raped her.
Gerard Williamson was charged with the murder of Anisha van Niekerk, as well as attempts to defeat the ends of justice, because he admitted to having moved her body from where he had killed her to an area closer to Kempton Park so that his story would be more believable. He would, however, never go on trial, as on the morning of the 29th of February 2008, he was found hanging in his cell. He had torn the handle of the sports bag, which was in his cell, and hung himself from the bars.
You know, what makes this case particularly sad is that she knew her perpetrator from before. It was a known person. And it speaks to what we've spoken about before in a couple of episodes about how most often the perpetrator would know their victim beforehand, especially with these rape cases and the murder and rape put together. But do we know anything about his history of abuse and the cases from before?
So Gerard Williamson was really a long-term predator. You know, his crimes go back to pretty much from his own early 20s. And something that was quite common for him was he would get involved in relationships with single moms who had young female children. And, that seemed to be a pattern for him. There were also, besides those children who had accused him of sexual abuse and rape, there were also female children within his own family who had also come forward once all of this came out to say that they too had been victims of his. And, many of the women that were in relationships with him were, they were abused by him, both physically, emotionally, financially. He also seemed to often get involved with women who were relatively financially stable, and then he would financially abuse them by not working on his own, using their money and basically living off them while simultaneously abusing them. And sadly, what happened, which is not uncommon with a predator like this, is he kept on getting off on these charges because, firstly, we know only 1 in 9 rapes in South Africa are actually reported, and very few actually successfully go all the way through the criminal justice system. But also because he was, through the act of abuse, he had an element of control and fear over these women. And, a lot of the times these individuals would then convince themselves that it would be easier and safer for them not to say anything and just move on with their lives as long as he was out.
Now, Dr. van Staden, we did touch upon some of those novel methods of how the body was identified. But I'd like to ask, are there any other challenges with a body that is decomposing in a case like this?
Apart from identification, the other problem that one has in a severely decomposed body is the fact that the injuries might be obscured and forensic evidence might be very difficult to obtain. Specifically in Anisha's case, where there was a head injury, the brain might be particularly decomposed, and one might not see if there's any hemorrhages or any bruising in the brain tissue itself. And that is actually what kills one, not necessarily the skull fractures or the injuries to the bony parts, which then obviously remains, but the injury to the organ underneath, which is the brain. So in Anisha's case, forensic anthropology was actually used to assist and to look at the injuries and to determine the extent of the injuries to the skull, but the brain was too decomposed to make much of a comment. The other problem is that biological evidence also tends to degenerate very quickly, especially as in this case where it is November, December, and the temperature is a major role player. So one might not be able to get DNA. If one does get semen, it might be too decomposed to actually extract DNA from it. So that is another problem. Apart from the fact that obviously it's very traumatic for families to have to see their loved ones in such a condition, or to even just know that their loved one was found in a severely decomposed condition.
Well, Dr. van Staden and Nicole Engelbrecht, I would like to thank you for joining me on this episode 8 of Once Upon a Crime. We do have one more episode to go before this mini-series is over, so do tune in for that next week.